Now I have the challenge of moderating the second panel. The second panel is about creating shared value across water, food security, and childhood nutrition, which deals basically with the links between water and nutrition. When we think about water and agriculture, for instance, we think agriculture can provide nutritious food and can generate decent jobs. But right now we do have the big problem of deteriorating soils and fresh water also being degraded. So this is something we need to think how to produce food in a more sustainable way and how to transform food and how to consume food. So to discuss this, I would like to invite to our stage first Mr. Laurent Freixe. Mr. Laurent is the CEO of Nestlé for the Americas, where he plays a leading role in promoting youth employment across the company. Thank you, Mr. Laurent. Mrs. Anne Veneman. Mrs. Veneman served as Executive Director of UNICEF from 2005 to 2010, and she was Secretary of the United States Department of Agriculture from 2001 to 2005. And now she's a member of the CSV Council. Let's give her a round of applause. Mr. Jan Lundquist. He's a Senior Scientific Advisor at Stockholm International Water Institute, and he's also a member of the CSV Council. Thank you. And finally, Mr. Guanche Chen. He's a Senior Director of the Water Global Practice at the World Bank. Thank you. So I thought we could start with a few remarks, basically linking nutrition and water and the value of water stewardship. Maybe we could start with Mr. Laurent Freixe.
With pleasure. Thank you very much. And let me just start with a few comments to highlight the dimension of our footprint on the continent. You might not know that the Americas is the largest continent for Nestlé, by and large. And this is the US, but this is not only the US, this is also Latin America. We employ 110,000 people in the Americas, a couple hundred more indirectly. We have 158 factories, half in the US, half in Latin America, 22 in Brazil only. And of course, our business intersects with a number of societal issues, a number of which we have been discussing already. Nutrition, the double burden or the triple burden of malnutrition, as Jan would frame it, with some of the most overweight and obese countries in the world, in this continent, but also many people, millions of people, still suffering from undernutrition. And we got programs up and running across our countries, especially in Latin America, of micronutrient fortification, 22 billion portions in Brazil only. And we are working actively at reformulating our products. We are working as well at promoting children education, good and healthy lifestyles, good eating habits. You get to learn them as a child, and of course that lasts for a lifetime, and promoting also physical education is high on the agenda. I'd like to come back shortly on the youth dimension. Youth unemployment is a critical issue on the continent as well. We have double-digit unemployment prevailing. We got millions of youngsters nor in education, neither in employment. And the big issue is that when they got a job, most of the time it's informal, which means precarity, lack of protection, and at the end of the day, lack of integration in society. And that reminds us that at the end of the day, the most direct contribution of business to society is through providing formal employment and education. So big focus on our side on that, promoting youth employability, youth employment, and helping youngsters make the bridge between the education system and the job market, promoting vocational education, the one that combines the theory and the practice as the best form of education. And of course, we got only one planet, so environmental sustainability is high on the agenda. I'm very happy to report that we got our first 000 factory in Brazil with zero carbon footprint, zero waste to landfill, and also zero water footprint. So water is very, very high on the agenda. Water scarcity prevails in many parts of the continent. We use largely, massively agricultural raw material, and we know that 70% of water usage goes into the agricultural sector. So that's critical. We use water in our factories. And progressively, we move from reducing our water footprint in our operation, and we have aggressive and ambitious targets in this respect, to engaging in shared water management programs. And actually, we decided last year to engage our 158 factories into water stewardship programs. So all our factories today are engaged with their communities, with farmers, with industry, with all users at defining the best possible ways to preserve this common resource and make meaningful actions to have a positive impact. Those are.
Laurent, you mentioned before Anne Veneman starts to talk, I just wanted to ask a question regarding what you just said. You mentioned that you're generating youth employment, it's one of your goals, and you also had mentioned that you managed to reduce a lot the use of water in Nestlé's factories, and that you have programs with the community. It's called the Water Stewardship Program, right? Yeah. If you could talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, so the idea is that we have an impact directly through our activities, through our factories, through our distribution system, but we have to look at the broader picture. And a big part of the water usage is taking place in the farm, in the fields, and we need to engage there, of course, and we need to engage also with the broader user base, and this is what we want to do through our factories. Our factories are not located or rarely located near the cities. They are in the countryside next to the commodities supply, next to the farms, and we do believe that there we can make a meaningful impact, engaging in the spirit of what has been described, engaging with the communities, engaging and working with the farmers, and working with the broader community at large.
Thank you. Now, Anne Veneman, if you could tell us, I mean, you were telling us so many interesting things, but maybe you want to start first before going to the technological aspect of it.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. As I listen to the conversation, I'm probably one of the few people who have worked in government, in the private sector, and in the NGO sector. And I've seen over the years the difficulty that all have had, as Mark Kramer said, in working together. They've looked at each other more as the enemy than as the cooperator. So this announcement today, I think, is significant, but also the conversation we're having about how important it is to really bring everyone, from the new generation to the existing businesses, to governments, to the NGO sector, around these issues, because unless we do, these are big global issues and they won't be solved without everyone coming to the table and making hard decisions. One of the things we've talked about today is how much there is an intersection among these issues of water and agriculture, water and economic development, water and nutrition, and as part of that, water and health. And so I think it is very important to see how interconnected these issues are. We've already heard that agriculture globally uses about 70% of fresh water in the world. So we have a global population that's going to rise to an estimated 9.7 billion people by the year 2050. Now, some have predicted, I don't necessarily agree with this, but that we will have to increase food supply to meet that population demand by about 60%. At the same time, we see the statistics that in this world we're wasting 30 to 40% of the food we produce. So we have to look at all of these issues and the impact of water. So we have an increasing global demand. We have the impact of climate change. All of these impact on water supply, availability of quality water, and the supply of water and the availability of water are all going to be paramount to the future. So when we look at water and we look at agriculture, one of the issues, of course, I've been involved in, particularly through the UN work, but also in running a major government department that deals with food security, is that for too long, the world has focused on the issue of hunger and how to meet that objective by calories. And we have not focused nearly enough on the issue of nutrition. So we see the shift of conversation becoming more and more prevalent among the communities that we deal with today. So we just talked about this triple burden of malnutrition. We've seen a tremendous drop in the percentage of people in the world who suffer from chronic hunger. It's now about just over 800 million people who suffer from chronic hunger. There are 2 billion people in the world who are overweight. 600 million of those are obese. And there are 2 billion people in the world who have some kind of micronutrient deficiency, the most prevalent of which is iron deficiency. So that's the triple burden we're dealing with just from a statistical perspective. So undernutrition is also, of course, at UNICEF we dealt with child mortality, child nutrition, a number of these issues. So we've often measured child mortality of under 5 mortality and looked at many issues in that, through that lens. The undernutrition contributes to, doesn't necessarily cause, but if you have malaria and you're undernourished, you're more likely to die. It contributes to about half of childhood deaths. Now, as we've addressed nutrition and under fives, one of the things that has become more and more apparent in the last several years has been the importance of the first 1,000 days of life. That begins from conception, from the time the baby is in the womb, through the second birthday. And one of the things we know is that without adequate nutrition, that brain development will be impacted. This then has a lifelong impact. It impacts the child's ability to learn in school. It impacts the adult ability to earn as an adult, and therefore it perpetuates this cycle of poverty. So how do we bring along water in this issue? One of the biggest drivers of malnutrition in children is diarrheal disease. The second biggest killer of children under 5, after pneumonia, is diarrhea. Diarrhea saps the system of needed nutrients, thereby creating this situation where you potentially have lack of nutrients causing brain development issues. So I think that we have to think about these water issues in a very comprehensive way. If you look, and I know that my colleague here, Jan, is going to talk more about how water really impacts the SDGs, but if you really look at water, it impacts so many of the SDGs. So as we go forward, I really think we look at water as such a critical element across so many of these issues.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. Jan?
Thank you very much, Patricia. And also a sincere thanks to Nestlé colleagues for having invited me to this forum. I really enjoy it. Let me say also from the beginning here that I grew up on a farm. So I know from where the food is coming. And I know the water problems also. And I would like to say that I think many of the contemporary young generation are brought up in urban areas. They don't have that kind of bodily experience of where the food is coming from and the water. Now, my father wouldn't agree, but I would say that in principle, we can produce food without land, but not without water. And it takes a huge amount of water to produce the food. So for a typical diet in a rich or a middle-class society, the daily water budget is in the order of 5 tons per capita per day. Now, for a vegetarian diet, it would be, as Claudia mentioned to me here when we walked down here, a vegetarian diet is, of course, much less, maybe 2.5 tons. Even a lean diet in a poor country would not be possible to produce with less than, say, about 1.5 tons of water. So we eat literally 1,000 times more water as compared to what we drink. And that's a biological, and it's a production in an open landscape. It's very different from industrial production. I have done some calculations together with colleagues at the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome, and we looked upon 3 trends during the last 50 years. That is what's happening in the food production side, food supply, and then the water requirements to produce that food, and what's happening in society in terms of human well-being, the triple malnutrition that we talked about here before. And the 50-year period is very important to say, because we don't see so much of trends if we look upon short-term changes. I mean, climate change, we study over long periods. And the same, we should have a long-time perspective when we look upon food security and nutritional aspect. It takes time for this system to change. But the changes that we have seen during the last 50 years, from the beginning of the 1960s, they are quite amazing, I would say. The per capita production, the per capita supply of food has increased in the order of 30% per capita, 30%, in spite of a population increase from about 3.5 to 7.5 billion. So it's a tremendous increase. Of course, there are significant variations, especially at the local level and between socio-economic groups. But the good news is that this increase in the food supply on the supply side, it has brought down the prevalence of undernourishment quite significantly. Not everywhere, not completely. But it's also important to say that there's no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to water. So if we look upon the correlation or the relationship between the positive effects on food production and supply and the implication in terms of how much water we mobilize and make use of, we see now that water is running out literally in many parts of the world. Desiccated rivers, sinking groundwater levels. I hear in California, they're down to 600 meters, 700 meters in Chicago, 300 or 400 meters are common in India, and so on. And we also see in the World Economic Forum, the Global Risks Report, that water is among the top of the perceived risks. So water is a tremendous risk factor today. And both the farmers are both the agents and the victims of this development. Now, there's another very serious trend which has already been mentioned by Anne and by Laurent, namely the increasing, should we say, malnutrition in terms of overeating and the wrong type of food. I think you mentioned, Anne, that it's about 3 times more people today who are overweight, obese, or suffer from micronutrient deficiency as compared to those who are undernourished. So I think that the general figure for people's estimating the amount of food losses and waste, it's about 30%. If we would add figures on overeating, which is also a kind of food waste, I would say, roughly, I would argue, roughly 50% of the world's food production is questionable. 50%. And you can imagine the links to water, to energy, to land use, to investments, whatever. So I would like to make a reference to Charles Dickens and his famous statements in his book, A Tale of Two Cities from 1859. He said that we are living in the best of times and we are living in the worst of times. And that is what we have today. And this is the world that our children are inheriting. Now, what we see behind here on the wall, the theme here is that the water is the driver of Sustainable Development Goals. I would say maybe we should look upon the other way around. The Sustainable Development Goals is a strong driver for water management, water stewardship. If we don't get the different goals right, then we will not get water right either. And it's rather, I think, striking to see that the Sustainable Development Goal number 6, which is about water, they don't mention irrigation water. It's not mentioned. You have to go to the other goals and the other targets to look upon water and food issues. So I would say that if we look upon the Sustainable Goal number, the target 2.2, which is to eliminate all types of malnutrition till 2030. Eliminate all types of malnutrition in the world till 2030. If we would do that, that would also include reducing the overeating and the wrong kind of food. That would have a tremendous impact on water. If we go to target number 12.3, which is to reduce the losses and waste of food and supply chain by 50%. Paul is part of that champions group who are involved in the implementation of 12.3. If 12.3 is implemented, there would be no more water scarcity in the world. So I think it's important, it's amazing to look upon how water interconnects. You talked about it, Dan, cuts across the different goals and cuts across all ways of all parts of our life. Yeah, I think that's enough for now.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you. Guanche?
Thank you very much, and thank you for Nestlé for organizing this forum and invite the World Bank to say a few words. Much has been said about the water scarcity problem, and this is even compounded by deteriorating water quality problem. So I'm just going to summarize it to say water has emerged as a silent emergency as we speak. And this is why I think you also mentioned about World Economic Forum, when water consistently over the last 5 years as one of the highest risk factor. One of the things that we also did at the World Bank Group over the last 2 years, 2 years ago actually, the World Bank Group President and the UN Secretary General convened a high-level panel on water. And that was basically to mobilize global action, consists of 11 head of state. In fact, two days ago, we launched the final report of the high-level panel, which we're going to launch that also next week in the World Water Day. Basically, I think we don't have time to go into detail. Essentially, the report is entitled Making Every Job Count, an agenda for water action. It really calls for a fundamental shift on how we want to manage water resources globally. And this is one of those, I would call it, a convening services that the World Bank typically provide as a multilateral organizations. So that's the first. Second, we at the World Bank, the other major piece of service that we provide to our client country is the so-called knowledge service. On that, I would cite 2 things, which is very relevant on the subject on this panel. There were 2 reports we published last year, yes, in 2017. One is called Poverty Diagnostics, which links water supply and sanitation and hygiene with poverties, and with evidence to show the linkage between these various factors. And this also highlighted inadequate water services is a very powerful factor that associated with infectious disease, with long-lasting effects such as impaired cognitive development and stunting. And I think Madam Secretary also mentioned about this impact on health, and this is obviously correlated by our analysis. But it also shows, this analysis also shows that the effective way to address this water supply and sanitation health issue has to be a multi-sectoral approach. It's not going to be a one-sector solution. The other major piece of analytical work we did last year is called uncharted water. This is interesting. Again, I think Anne mentioned about the fact that about sort of when you have water scarcity, the impact on health, particularly first 1,000 days of a children birth. We actually have evidence to show, this is a data set we obtained from African continent, that dry shock, which is drought, in their infancy, if children affected or born during the dry shock in the first 1,000 days, typically they don't reach their full mental and physical potential. It's called stunting. And they drop out of school earlier, likely to have more children, and maybe stunned, right? And also less health. But more tragically, our evidence actually show that this impact is actually is intergenerational. In fact, girls born in those years will impact on their next generation. This is the vicious cycle that we really need to avoid. The study also shown that rainfall deficit, again, during drought area, it will ruin harvest and crop and destroy crop, which all we know that. But what is the evidence shows is that this loss could lead to something like a food loss production that could feed something like 80 million people a year, which is the size of Germany. Of course, when something like that happens, it's not Germany that will suffer, it's the poor country that will suffer. And another surprising from this report is that poor rain could also induce farmer into expanding cropland into forests, and which then, of course, it would destroy forests and lead to the destruction of forests and carbon sink. So we actually sort of deteriorating the carbon impact. So which is why I think we all agree addressing this challenge are critically important. This is why I think, in this particular session, we're talking about creating a shared value across water, health, nutrition. We must not take water as granted, because for many years, humankind take water as is freely available, which is not the case anymore. I just want one more thing. I mentioned two main services. The last one that the World Bank we do, of course, is on the financing side, for which we always support projects in over 100 countries. Typically, our investment in the water sector is about 15% of our World Bank portfolio. But in fact, this is something I'm going to talk about next week. But at the same time, I really want to call upon that at the moment, publicly available resources for investing in water is largely inadequate. And it's not going to get more. So we need to somehow work together and crowd in commercial finance to invest in water infrastructures, water institutions, and water services.
Thank you, Guanche. Thank you. And I was wondering, we were talking before, a big part of the water consumption in agriculture is producing animal proteins, right? So I'm sure, as Jan was saying, there's a decrease in protein consumption in some countries, but these are the tiny minority. In developing countries, you're still having, people getting into the middle class and starting to eat meat, right? What are alternatives or research for protein substitutes or some other sort of technology that could help us?
Well, I think this... Hello? Oh, there we go. I think this is a very interesting question, because we had this conversation as we were getting ready for this panel that actually in Sweden, meat consumption is going down. But when I cited the statistic that some are predicting that there will be a 60% increase in demand for food with the increase in population in 2050, it is largely around the fact that as incomes go up, diets improve, and therefore people begin to have more demand for animal protein, which is why, even though in some countries it's starting to go down, there are, interestingly, I come from the state of California, where we have the Silicon Valley. And the Silicon Valley may be a lot about technology and information technology, but there's also a tremendous amount going on around food. And one of the things I found very interesting that we were talking about is how many of these technologies, and we talked about how important technology is generally to agriculture. The panel before talking about precision agriculture, everything from things that are helping with small farmer access to weather information, to M-Pesa with getting, some of your farm information and your farm payments and so forth, to, the use of drones for looking at crop production and drought areas and so forth. But I think where some really interesting things is going on is around the issue of how do you get more and more animals out of the food system. So there are organizations that are working on certainly, vegetable-based product like Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods, hamburgers that can still bleed, but it's a substitute with vegetable. But others are working on replacing animal product with other products, such as cultured meat. So they're taking the cells of meat and reproducing them in the laboratory and hope to bring it to scale. There is one company called Hampton Creek who hopes to have something on the market by next year. They are also the company that has removed eggs from mayonnaise with a vegetable substitute, and they now have actually an egg product on the market. There's a tremendous movement around all of these, whether it's one called Memphis Meats. There's an organization in California called Perfect Day. They're looking at taking dairy product and replicating it by the use of bioengineered yeast. And they're having quite a lot of success in their initial experimentation. I think there are issues about whether or not ultimately the publics will be interested in consuming this product. There's also a lot of, by the way, protein work, alternative protein work going on around insect product production. It's amazing for those of us who live in the developed world to realize about 2 billion people in the world actually have insects as part of their regular diet. So this is not really out of the ordinary for many people, but there is a lot of research and product development in that area as well. So I think the whole range of research projects that are going on around alternatives to animal agriculture, because of both the impact on the environment as well as concerns about impact on nutrition, are growing areas that are worth watching.
Thank you, Anne. You want to add something?
If I may complement what Anne has just highlighted and confirm that there is an increasing demand for protein, plant-based proteins, and as there is an increasing demand, there is also an increasing offering, and we are integrating those dimensions into our offering. We got a large range, an increasing range of plant-based beverages or meat analogs in Brazil, in Latin America. We recently made 2 acquisitions. One in Latin America, a company called Terra Fertile, who's got as part of its offering those plant-based beverages. And we just made also an acquisition in the US of a company called Sweet Earth, which is proposing those meat analogs as part of the offering. And those companies are enjoying huge growth rates and are hugely successful. So we really believe in it, and we are really investing on our side as well.
Interesting. Yeah, you want to add something? I wanted to add a question too, but go ahead.
No, I can just supplement what Anne mentioned earlier about Sweden. That there seems to be break in the trends for increasing demand for meat or animal protein, as you say. But I think we have to be a little bit careful about the figures here, because when I read in the Swedish newspaper, listen to programs on radio and television in Sweden, they talk about food consumption figures. And food consumption figures, they refer to what we buy and procure, not what we eat. So we have no idea about how much there is a reduction in eating in Sweden. And from a nutritional point of view, the important thing is what we eat, not what we buy. And then we have the difference is the bones and the skin, different parts of the animal produce, which is not edible. That's a big part. And then we throw away part of it. But so the amount of food, the amount of meat product that people in Sweden are eating is probably half of what is supposed to be the consumption of meat. Huge difference. And most planners don't know about this difference because the terminology is not clear in this term. But I think there's also interest, both in Sweden and in many other countries. There are many examples now of restaurants, high-level restaurants, which are going for vegetarian menus, which are quite popular. And I heard about the company in Brazil earlier during the lunch, Natura or something like that, which is very progressive and very successful in terms of making use of the vegetarian products. So I think there are a number, and in India, we have a number of cases in India where you have a combination of restaurants and food industry, which are, should we say, supporting the going back to a diversified, good Indian cuisine with lovely dishes. So meat is not a necessary trend. I don't think so. But meat has become very cheap also, you know. The price of meat in Sweden is only about, I mean, it's much less than it used to be when I was young. So there are very few economic incentives in most countries, I would think, for switching the food habits to more sound diets.
Well, maybe Mr. Chen could add something to this too.
I would just add one angle, looking at the global perspective. Much has been said about the fact that there will be, well, the bottom line is that per capita availability of fresh water by 2050 is going to be much less than today. So essentially, there's not going to be the same amount of water to feed this expanding population. Add to that is the deteriorating water quality. So I think globally, I think we need to look at this global system as a whole and see where, at some point, we have to think about some sort of virtual trade of water. Meaning that, for example, we're sitting here in Brazil, which actually, luckily endowed with very good natural resources in terms of water. But many parts of the world, the natural endowment is not there. But paradoxically, we're actually seeing countries that are in arid area are using water even more inefficiently compared to countries that are with abundant water. So ultimately, one has to ask the question whether in some country, whether they can actually afford to grow agricultural product in the middle of a desert, which are doing that, some countries there. So we can't afford it because the groundwater is also limited. At some point, they will be exhausted. So we have to think about, this is obviously looking ahead. It's not easy, obviously. In some countries, we're only talking about within one country, trading water. For example, in Australia, in many countries in the world, we can't even do that within country. To think about globally is going to be very drastic. But it's something we really need to think ahead if we're facing this scarcity in the future.
You had mentioned before that there's an awful insufficient amount of funding or credit for water initiatives. How do you see the role of the private sector in those initiatives?
Sure. Talking about SDG here, we actually did an estimate 2 years ago when the SDG was announced to meet the SDG 1 and 2, which is safely managed water supply and sanitation. Globally, we're talking about developing countries because developed country access is already there, mostly. In developing countries, we need about $115 billion investment a year. At the moment, public sector, including multilateral altogether, are investing roughly about $30 billion. So there's a huge gap if we really want to meet that goal by 2030. So our idea, and which I'm sure we'll share with many, is that we need to find a way to make water attractive investments, to be able to attract sort of commercial investment into the sector. And that requires water utility, that company that manage water services to become creditworthy. There are good examples of that. Sitting here, Sabesp, which is the largest company in Brazil, has been accessing commercial finance for the last 15, 20 years. And last year, a small country nearby, Uruguay, the OSE, which is the national utility, they were able to issue $30 million of domestic bond and oversubscribed by domestic investors because they were basically creditworthy. And that means obviously it requires a much better valuing system, a much better pricing system, because in many parts of the world, particularly in places where water service is minimal, the pricing is very low as well. Of course, there's a need for providing water for poor people. We can use subsidy for that purpose, but making sure the subsidy is targeted. But ultimately, we need to crowd in much more resources into the water sector to be able to meet the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal.
Thank you. Jan, you were mentioning before, I mean, everybody here on the panel about the seriousness of the triple malnutrition problem and how maybe changing the supply of food or the production, agricultural production to more nutritious food could change this. Can you talk a little bit about this? Maybe get farmers, yes. Yes?
I think that if you look upon the farming system in large part of the world, I mean, we have a huge production of different type of staple crops. And for most of those staple crops, they are not very profitable for farmers. I think it would be possible to identify crops that could give a higher nutritional value and at the same time provide the farmers with a decent income. I mean, we could take, for instance, that would be, instead of producing rice, maize, such things, it would be, I think it would be a fascinating idea to try to promote more of different types of beans, the different types of vegetables, which are high in nutritional value and which are not high in water consumption. But and if you go to fruits and some of the fruits, then it's they are also rich in vitamins and so on. But the other problem is, I think, the supply chain, because many of those products, they require to be delivered to the consumer, to the markets in a short period of time. I mean, if you grow paddy or if you grow maize, you can keep a sack under in your building for months, for longer time, without any degradation of quality, basically. But for many of the high-value crops, which are also high in nutritional value, they require a very efficient marketing system. So I think that is very important. I think there's another type also which has not been mentioned here before, namely that the possibility, which Nestlé is dealing a lot with, fortification. I mean, there's a possibility to fortify, for instance, maize. But I think there have been, I mean, the appearance of the maize cob will look different as compared to the non-fortified. And as far as I understand, there are some, and the taste might be a little bit different. So there might be some challenges where the consumers who are used to a certain type of food item, and then even if the other alternative would be better, it might not be picked up so quickly.
Anne wanted to add something, and then we're going to open for questions from the audience. If you want to ask a question, there are microphones around the room. If you just state your name and your organization, but Anne's going to say something first.
Yeah, I think in addition to what's available, it is also an issue of education. There are too many people around the world, in both the developed and the developing world, that don't understand nutrition, what's good for them. There's a lot of people that no longer know how to prepare and cook food. I was involved in the release of a public policy report that we did in Washington this week. And the premise of that report is that poor nutrition is hugely contributing to the cost of healthcare around the world. I mean, this was focused on the United States, but in the United States and around the world, the cost of healthcare is just skyrocketing, primarily related to nutrition-related disease. Today, non-communicable diseases kill more people in the developing world than do communicable diseases. This has been a huge shift in now focus for the World Health Organization, for example. This is not what the development community, the UN and the World Bank were dealing with. Even 10 or 12 years ago, we didn't know this. Now we know that the issue of nutrition, non-communicable disease, and the cost of healthcare are so linked together, and it is all related to what people are eating.
Thank you. So I think we had a question over there.
Very much. My name is Isabel Teixeira. I'm the former Minister for the Environment in Brazil. And also today I'm the co-chair of the International Resource Panel of the United Nations. I think that I'd like to comment 3 points. First of all, when we proposed, I was one of the members of a high-level panel that proposed SDGs, okay? And also the agenda, the global agenda, that I'm so happy to see you here discussing this. But I remember when you proposed this, one of the key issues that we like to address is how can you bring the different societies around the world, to have less inequalities in such a way that you can see each other consider developing in developing countries. To have business and to have these connections or these strategic links that we are discussing here during this afternoon in Brasilia. I was born in this city, okay? So I have really a history with not only my country, but with environmental issues here. When you propose this, we are exactly discussing how we can bring these different societies around the world closer, and you can identify what are the new drivers that will be responsible to address the key issues for developing this century. Second, we proposed these issues. It was really hard to have 169 targets. Somebody doesn't make sense. Because you have 17 goals and 169 targets, exactly to identify priorities among different societies around the world, and also to bring together, developing countries. This is not easy to share and to try to bring solutions considering different experience and also different challenges. In a country like Brazil, as you mentioned, different initiatives and good ones, it's absolutely important to understand that the agriculture sector is a tropical agriculture. And tropical agriculture is different from the agriculture that's practiced in the north of the planet. And the requirements for water security in a country like Brazil and also agriculture development, they are completely different than you have, for example, United States. And when you need to do business and to have the costs and be efficient, you need to understand what are the requirements, mini technological requirements to make the difference. For example, to have agriculture as a strategic play as we have today in Brazil as an economic sector. Probably you don't know, 40 years ago, Brazil will import food in this country. Today, we are the biggest producer of food in the world. And these have costs, and environmental costs, and high social costs. How you can shift this? Because you know our role in the future, consider the food security that all the world discussing the role of Brazil, but how can you transform the costs of the past for assets in the future? This is really a message that this forum or this debate, consider the initiative from how you can have business, can provide as innovative. And also, you need to avoid my last comment. I'm a member of the International Resource Panel. You launched a report last year in Nairobi during the Global UN Environmental Assembly, showing that if you promote or if you decide to have economic development on the same basis that we have been discussing the last 30 years, you don't have natural resource assets in the world to fulfill sustainable development goals requirements. This is a scientific conclusion. Okay? So you didn't propose SDGs to become another issue to promote inequalities among global societies.
Thank you, Minister.
It's really, really important that we can discuss a fair and inclusive development, making sense considering what the requirements that we have in the disputes today when they're promoting business. So my opinion is that this is a good connection, but we need to move beyond. Okay? And my last comment, I do apologize.
Please, it's just because we're running out of time.
To discuss the future, please bring people that will be in the future. Okay? They must be here. The new ones that are responsible for business in the future. Not only us, but bring the young
I think there
people.
are a lot of entrepreneurs here. Yes. Thank you very much, Minister, for your comments. Does anyone want to comment on that? I mean, it's very broad and... No? Okay. I guess there's a consensus. Thank you. Thank you. I think we have time for just one more question. Does anyone in the audience? Okay. The future has a question, by the way.
Thanks. My name is Andrea. I am from Bolivia and also from Global Shapers. My question is, how to involve civil society to improve the state of the nutrition, particularly in the children with less resources than the other part of the population. My city is knowledge because we have a lot of issues with the water. The less than 50% of the population doesn't have water. The other 30% have water once a week. So I want to know how to improve, but adding effort from the civil society.
Thank you. As Mr. Lundquist said before, it should be a universal, basic human right to have access to clean water for sanitation and drinking. So maybe if you want to add something, how civil society and the private sector could help on that. Sorry.
Maybe what I can highlight is that, of course, those issues require an all-of-the-society approach, and that relates also to the comment which was made earlier by the minister. We had a very interesting experience in Brazil, in San Jose Rios Pardos, is that right, Juan Carlos? Where we partners with schools, with the communities, to try to bring better nutrition to the kids, starting with school canteens, trying to promote physical education, trying to bring nutrition education to the children at school, and trying to do that in a microcosm where we could measure impact and result. And it's tremendous to see the engagement this has triggered in the community and the impacts. The issue, as always, is how do we scale that up? But it's possible. And indeed, our experience is that engaging in an all-of-the-society approach to tackle those critical issues brings results.
Thank you so much, Laurent. I think we're running out of time. That's too bad. We had so many interesting things to discuss. But now I'm sure you all need to digest all this information. We have a coffee break right now. 20 minutes. Please be back in 20 minutes if possible. Swiss time, not Brazilian time, please. Thank you all, and thank you, panelists. Thank you very much.